Welcome back to another video where I talk about stuff. And in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about the little country that could. And by that I mean Israel. It's a relatively small country that is about the size of New Jersey, not large geographically in terms of land mass. It's about 0.1% of the Middle East in terms of land mass. It is just a speck on the map, and the population is less than 10 million, of which there's about roughly 7 million Jews, 2.5 million Arabs, of which a little bit more than 2 million, or 22% of the population, are Muslim. Another hundreds of thousands are Christian. And of course, there's a blend of people of other faiths, whether they be, Jews who believe in Buddhism, or people who were born Muslim or Arab or of some kind and changed to something else. Maybe they became Zen Taoists. Maybe they became atheists. Maybe they became agnostic. Who knows? There's all kinds of people here with all kinds of beliefs. Because as small of a country as it is equally diverse in its opinions. And you know the old expression, you put two Jews in a room, you get 3 opinions. Well, you put almost 10 million Israelis in a country, think about how many opinions you're going to get. And by the way, Arabs are also very opinionated. You put two Arabs in a room, you're also going to get 3 opinions, as the expression goes. There is no shortage of opinions among the Arab people, especially those living in Israel. They're very strong in their opinion, and God bless them for it, because you know what? As part of being a member of the society, you get to have your opinions. Now, why do I mention this? Why does this even matter? What's even interesting about the fact that Israel is a small place with lots of different kinds of people who have lots of different opinions? Well, if you were to believe everything as it is reported, then you might think that Israel is not like that. You might think Israel is a big, huge country dominating over its Arab neighbors with a massive military and empirical ambitions and desire to be bigger than it already is, to control more lands from the Tigris from the Nile to the Euphrates, as in the old kingdom of King David. Well, if that were the case, why has Israel accepted exchanging land for peace at practically every turn since its inception? In fact, since before its inception. Israel accepted 10% of the land originally promised to it at the turn of the 20th century at San Remus. 10% of the land. Right? It was supposed to be that all of what is now Israel, plus all of what is now considered the future Palestinian state, plus all of what is now Jordan, which was used to be called Transjordan. Right? That's a name made up out of whole cloth also, just based on the fact that the river's name is Jordan. So they called the land across the river Transjordan, across the Jordan. All of that land, Jordan, plus all of what is now Israel, plus all of the areas that the Palestinians control in some way, shape, or form, including Gaza, including Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, which is the west bank of the River Jordan. All of that was supposed to be the Jewish homeland. What was known as British Mandate Palestine, all of it was supposed to be the Jewish homeland once the agreement of San Remus was signed. Now, why wasn't that agreed to later? Why did they change it? Well, they changed it because Sykes-Picot changed it. They decided to cut up the map even further and to give not half, 80% of the land to a country that they would invent called Transjordan. 80% of the land of the British Mandated Palestine that was supposed to be given to the Jews was given to Arabs in order to not upset the Arabs. 80%. And the Jews still said, okay, whatever. Can we just please have our homeland? Not so fast. Then, so that was basically all of Transjordan was agreed to be given to the Arabs of Transjordan, which wasn't even a state yet. But it was agreed to be that it would become land given to Arabs in some way. And in 1947, Jordan was established as a state when they literally plucked the king out of thin air and said, "You are now the king of this land." Right? So started the Hussein family monarchy dynasty. And the land that is now Israel, plus the land that is under Palestinian control in some way, shape, or form, that was 20% of that original piece of land. Okay, they were still saying, okay, now we're going to have it be, that'll be the Jewish state. And then they said, no. The Arabs refused that too and rioted and did all kinds of acts of violence in order to pacify them. They agreed to chop it down further and say, okay, we're going to give 45% of the land of what remains of what could be a Jewish homeland, the heartland of the Jewish population, literally their birthplace. We're going to give 45% of that land to the Arabs who are living in British Mandated Palestine. And we're going to give the Jews 55%, but the Jews are going to get mostly desert and swamps and areas that are not great for farming back in those days. And we're going to give the Arabs all the areas of Judea and Samaria, literally the homeland of the Jewish people, like the birthplace, yeah. Like if you want to get really local on the map. Because, yeah, sure, there were Jews all across what is now Israel, but our birthplace is in Judea and Samaria as a people. And we're going to give all of that to the Arabs. And you're only going to have 45% of the land. Yeah, but it's all the arable land. It's all the land that's really easy to grow stuff in. It's all the hills, all the high points, all the elevation, everything from a secure point of view is better. The only thing that's different or not a strategic advantage is you don't have immediate access to the sea when you're on the top of the hill. Okay, but you're still on the top of the hill. Back in those days, it mattered a lot because you have the advantage of elevation. Now, of course, the Israeli military has, a very powerful air force, so elevation, not a problem. But it is a problem for people who live on the land day to day and might come under gunfire or shell fire or other kinds of attacks, ballistic or otherwise. And so they gave all the best defensible positions to the Arabs, who did not call themselves Palestinians in those days. They just called themselves Arabs. They were living in British Mandated Palestine. In fact, the only people that did call themselves Palestinians back then were actually the Jews living in British Mandated Palestine, because it was a term that was referred to commonly. Yes, we know for 1800 years the Romans gave the land the name, Palestine, basically. Not Palestine, but Syria, Palestina, which eventually got translated into Palestine, and the name stuck for the region, but it was never a country, and nobody ever called themselves Palestinians until Jews started to come back to the land, and they were being called that, especially by people in the media, newspapers, etc., who would say, Jews in Palestine did this, and then they would eventually refer to them as Palestinian Jews or just Palestinians. But they were not Palestinians as a nation, or as a country. They were Palestinians in that they lived under the British Mandate for Palestine, which was a British colony. So a colonializing empire, the Romans, gave the name Syria Palestina to the land, which eventually became Palestine, which eventually got taken over by many other colonializing empires, and ended up in the last colonializing empire to date in this land was the British Empire. After the Ottomans, you know, before them the Mamluks, before them the Arabs, etc., etc. Right? It goes back and forth many times, and eventually it was decolonialized by the Jews, who bought back their lands, bought their lands, their ancestral homelands. Right, so they bought back the land of the ancestors from many, 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 many generations and even eons ago, who had been forced out, who had been ethnically cleansed from the Jewish homeland by the Romans. The second time that was happened, because the first time it wasn't the Romans, was it? No, it wasn't. And sorry, it just gets a little bit complicated to talk about sometimes. And what happened was that okay, so the Jews bought back their land when they started coming here as in the footsteps of Theodore Herzl's political Zionist movement. Keep in mind, there were already Jews coming back here from about 100 years before he made that Zionist movement, and there were already Jews here when they first showed up, because there were always Jews here. There has always been a presence of Jews here since the first Jews were alive. Always. There was never a time when there were actually zero here. Always somewhere survived. We're living here. Always. There's archaeological evidence across the eons, across the centuries, you name it, different locations all over the country. So Jews bought back the land from Arabs, and whoever else might have owned it. Some British lord might have owned some land or whatever, and was willing to sell it. They also bought that, but yeah, mostly from Arabs who owned land, and they bought it during the Ottoman Empire, by the way, as well as when the British were here. But they bought most of it during the Ottoman Empire, like the late 1800s, or even the mid 1800s, and the late 1800s, and the early 1900s, and then into during the British Mandate. And all that time, Israel just accepted less and less and less land, to the point where they literally, by the time the partition plan came around, the piece of land that was offered to the Jews, that 45% of the land of Israel, and the 55% of the land of Israel, which is mostly desert, mostly the Negev desert, right? Mostly barren. I wouldn't call it wasteland, but it's a desert, right? Most of that land, not just a desert, but it represents in total, if you add it all up from the north to the south, it represents about 10% of the land that was originally set aside for the Jews at San Remus. Now, again, the reason that the land was divided up as stupidly as it was is because the French and the British were trying to placate very aggravated forces who were irate at the notion that Jews might control their own homeland, something that the likes of Haj Amin al-Husseini refused to accept, which is why he became such a good friend of Adolf Hitler during World War II, and was in fact one of the highest paid members of the Nazi Party in terms of his salary or money he received from them or whatever. So all this time, right, when they say, oh, the Jews need to agree to divide the land, Israel needs to agree to a two-state solution. Israel already agreed to a two-state solution. In fact, it even agreed to a three-state solution. It agreed to a two-state solution when it agreed to let the Arabs have everything east of the River Jordan, what is now the land of the country Jordan. And then they agreed to give away land to another state. So they agreed really to a three-state solution because Jordan hadn't even been created yet. It was just a proposal, and they hadn't even named it. So they agreed to what is now Jordan and to an Arab state in British Mandate Palestine west of the River Jordan. So Israel agreed to a two-state solution and a three-state solution. Well, the first part of that happened. Jordan became a country. First, it was called Transjordan, and then it was called Jordan. Palestinians never got a state. The Arab Palestinians never got a state because their leaders refused to have a state. The Jordanians had no reason to refuse. There were very few Jews left living in Jordan by the time Jordan became a country, and any that were promptly left to go to Israel for their own safety. This was at a time long before Jordan was at peace with Israel. Jordan was one of the main armies that attacked Israel in 1948 and was well supplied with British arms, considered to be the best in the world at the time, as well as American arms, yeah. And they had British officers considered to be among the most professional military officers in the world at the time, along with, of course, the Americans, but it was the British who trained the Jordanians and armed them and supplied them. And all of the other Arab nations that attacked Israel, guess what? They were also armed and trained and supplied by the British. The French also had a bit of a helping hand in the case with Syria, for example, and Lebanon. So the two main powers of the world, or certainly of the region at the time, were in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, were still France and Great Britain. The United States was not the world's superpower. It was a budding superpower, and it was very quickly to become that, especially in between, after the great victory in World War I, and then the amazing victory in World War II. After World War II, it was clear and evident, since the U.S. had nuclear supremacy and won the war, led the victory of the war, that the U.S. was a superpower after World War II. But it wasn't until after World War II, and things were still changing. It wasn't like overnight. They were, no, they're the super. No, Great Britain was also a very powerful country still, and so was France. They were still relatively, proportionally, in the same league in terms of their global dominance and power, because they had a lot of presence in a lot of different countries all around the world. So when people say that Israel has to accept dividing up the land, the answer is historically Israel accepted it long ago, and the offer was rejected by the other side multiple times. It was rejected in every single step of the way that I just mentioned. Right? The Arabs refused to accept any division of the land from San Remus on. They refused the idea, obviously, of Israel, of a Jewish state becoming in control of what was all of the land of the British Mandate of Palestine. They refused a Jewish state in 20% of that land. They refused a Jewish state in 10% of that land, and they even refused a Jewish state at all. And when Israel was declared a nation again, a country in 1948, the very first act that our Arab neighbors did was to launch a genocidal attack against us, to literally try to wipe us all out. They literally told their people to leave so that they could kill all the Jews, and then the Arabs could come back a couple days later and take all of the things that the Jews had left behind. Like, that was literally their plan. Okay? That was literally their plan. And that's why you had 700,000 Arabs leave. Israel and the territories of Judea, Samaria, and some in Gaza. It was mostly at the hands of their own leaders. Now, did some people leave because of other reasons? Did some people leave because they went with the intention of coming back home, and generally thought that they were, because they were just scared of war, and so they just said, well, let's just get out of here? Yeah, there were absolutely people who were naive or ignorant or both, and who decided that it would be in their interest to leave, even if they weren't themselves, bad people. Yeah, it did happen. But they were misled by their leaders. And most of them left very willingly on the promise of, we're going to kill all the Jews and you can come back. And they didn't say, no, wait, hang on, that's wrong. They didn't stand up to their own leaders. They were supporting their leaders. There were very few people dissenting against the Arab leaders. And by the way, those that did are those who stayed. Right? So we know people stayed. How do we know people stayed? Well, because roughly 10 or 20% of them stayed. And they grew into the 2 million and more Arabs that we have living in Israel today. They certainly weren't 2 million then. They were a couple 100,000 people. And they agreed to stay and help us build a nation together. And in exchange, they would get equal rights, something which they never would have had under their own leadership, which we see to this day, 77 years, and they don't have equal rights. Not in Jordan, and certainly not under Palestinian rule. When I say equal rights, I mean among themselves. And if you say to me, well, why don't they have equal rights in Israel? They're not Israeli, and they don't live in Israel. If you want to talk about Israel proper, right? They're living in their own land, if you want to call it that. Right? If you believe that there's a country called Palestine and the people living there are Palestinians, well then, you have to understand that if, for example, you live in America and Mexicans or French people or whoever just shows up into your country, even on a tourist visa, that doesn't automatically grant them all of the same rights that you have as an American in America. Or if you're a person of any other country, same thing. If you live in Poland and somebody comes to visit you, even from Hungary or Norway or Brazil or Japan, it doesn't automatically give them all the same rights as you living in your country, in Poland, if you're Polish, right? So that's some crazy stuff when people say, wait, why don't the Palestinians have the same rights as the Israelis? Well, they don't live in the same country, right? I mean, sure, we can say it's the same country. Personally, I believe it should be the same country, in a sort of way. Like, the idea of a two-state solution is kind of dead in the water if you can read the political map. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but more and more, especially since after October 7th, Israelis are saying, you know what? We don't want a two-state solution anymore. The Arabs have never wanted one. The only people that have ever wanted it are people who don't live here. Like, sure, Israelis supported the idea because we thought, hey, if we can have real peace in exchange for a bit of land, even if it's our near and precious and dear homeland, we'll do it. We just want peace. All we want is to live side by side in peace with our neighbor. But that's the one thing our neighbors don't want. They don't want to live side by side in peace with us. I know some do. Yeah, I get it. I personally know some who do. But the vast overwhelming majority of them do not. And to pretend otherwise is to be foolish. It really is. It's to be foolish. I'm not just saying that to be a mean person or a bigot or whatever. No, far from it. I'm expressing their aspiration. They aspire to see the end of Israel. They tell you openly. Like, I'm not casting aspersions here. They're proud of it. Ask some people from this area who have opinions. Let's say Muslim Arabs who are not Israeli, who are what they call Palestinian. Ask them, what would you like to see happen? You will see that the majority of them would like to see Israel be dissolved from the map. It's not me making that up. That is the reality. And if you don't accept that reality, if you say, you know what, I know you're saying things that may be true, but I don't want that to be my reality, so I refuse to accept it. The only way you can validate your opinion in that case is to actually do something to not accept it, right? Well, hopefully you won't do anything violent to not accept it. Unfortunately, too many people have done violent things in this area. And it's a shame because there is really no other way for people in this area to continue, to get along other than to do what we're doing normally in Israel, which is most of us get along. In fact, really, most people, even in Judea and Samaria, Arabs and Jews, most of them get along. It's why we're not at war with them constantly. Like, yes, we're technically at war with them, but we're not out there doing street battles every single day for, 24 hours a day across the West Bank, right? Across Judea and Samaria. We're not fighting them like we're fighting in Gaza. Yes, we're fighting them with soldiers who occasionally have to go into houses or whatever, fight people, arrest people, do whatever they have to do. Usually the people that they're arresting or shooting at, whatever, are involved in some kind of action that requires police or military intervention. Like in any normal society, you have police and military who intervene when necessary to defend the national security or the local peace. And people want to say, well, the settlers are the ones causing all the violence. If you actually look at the amount of violence caused by settlers and the context of those acts of violence by settlers, it's not that there's zero acts of violence by settlers, but given the amount of settlers who live in the West Bank and the amount of times they are attacked, for example, while driving down the road and stones go through their car windows and practically kill them, or in many cases do kill them, or other acts of violence like that. Don't let anyone tell you that throwing stones ain't deadly, because it is. The actual number of Jews living in Judea and Samaria who cause actual violence and are the source of that problem and need to be prosecuted for what they did is infinitesimally small, especially when compared to the number of acts of violence in those very same areas by the Muslim Arabs who are anti-Israel. And again, yes, I know not all of them are violent people. I understand that. I've worked with plenty of people from those areas. I know very well that they're not all like that. But unfortunately, a significant number of them are. And they are led by terribly corrupt people. In Judea and Samaria by the PA, and in Gaza by the Hamas. And don't believe for a second that Gaza is the only place where the Hamas exists, because it isn't. The Hamas also exists in Judea and Samaria. They have a very strong presence there, and that is exactly why the Palestinian Authority does not want to have elections right now, because they know they would lose power in Judea and Samaria if there were elections right now. They know. And the Hamas would win it. And that, by the way, is possibly how the Hamas is going to agree to give up power in Gaza, because they know that even if they give up power in Gaza, they can always win an election in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, especially now after the war. So if they play their cards right, which they haven't yet, but hey, maybe something will happen someday. Um, they could actually give up power in Gaza and do that with the understanding between themselves that they're going to focus all their energy on taking over Judea and Samaria, or at least the Palestinian parts of it, and then drive the Palestinian Authority out of power, or they could become the Palestinian Authority and then gain international legitimacy by taking on that name. Because if they control that area, but not Gaza, well, then they could technically call themselves the Palestinian Authority. Just be like, yeah, we have new leaders now if they win it in an election, right? Even if they use violence, because, well, they did it in Gaza. Nobody said a word. And then they just called themselves the Hamas still because, well, they're still the Hamas. And they still say they hate the PA. But they would like to say that they hate the PA and they are the PA. They're the new PA. That we hate the old PA. We are the new PA. Why? Because that would give them instant credibility in the eyes of the useful idiots who would pretend it's just some normal transition of government. Oh, it's just Hamas going legitimate. No, Hamas is not going legitimate. There is no condition under which that happens. They're not a legitimate organization. They're a violent, suicidal death cult. They want to harm innocent people. They want the world to be forced to believe in the kind of God that they believe in and the kind of religion that they believe in, or else anybody who doesn't is either a slave of one type or another, a second-class citizen of one type or another, or dead. Like, if you don't convert to their way of thinking, those are your options. Be a slave, be a second-class citizen who pays high taxes and is humiliated, or die. There is no equal rights in their society for people who aren't the way they believe. It doesn't exist. If you think it exists, you don't know a damn thing about the religion of Islam and what it means and what it intends and what is jihad, which is a very real thing. And when people say globalize intifada or globalize the jihad or jihad worldwide, they have no idea what they're saying in most cases, which is a damn shame because in most cases, the people that are saying that are not even from this region. And they have no idea how hellish their life would be if the Islamic world were to take over their countries and apply Sharia law. Even Arab countries themselves, all across the Gulf, and in Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, even those countries have, at least for now, put on the new face of the Arab world and said, hey, we don't want that old world garbage. We're not interested in that. We're done with the old fighting. We'd rather just be a prosperous nation and make money and have a good economy and get along with everybody, right? That's what Abu Dhabi, across the United Arab Emirates, you have that in Bahrain, you have that even Saudi Arabia is like, saying, yeah, we want to make peace with Israel, but there's this whole Palestinian thing. We kind of have to, resolve that first in some way, or at least end the war in order to be able to even have quiet discussions again, which makes sense. I mean, I get it. It's a shame, but I understand why they say that, because they have a lot of crazies in Saudi Arabia who will not be okay with the idea of making peace with Israel. But they'll have no choice but to accept it if the king says it. But it'll be a lot easier for the king to say it and not have some kind of angry revolt if the Israelis can at least end the war with the Palestinians. And in the meantime, there's a lot of damage that can be done to the potential budding relationship. And you got to remember, this is why the war is happening. Why did Hamas launch the war? Again, I remind you, Hamas launched the war on October 7th to delay and derail any potential peace agreement between Israel and the Saudis. Like, that is 100% the reason that the war was launched on October 7th. That's why they chose that date, because it was shortly after Netanyahu had said at the UN, we're looking forward to making peace with the Saudis, and the Saudis had also said similar things about making peace with Israel, extending the Abraham Accords and all that stuff. And immediately, the war started, within a few weeks. And again, that's another one of the reasons you should do diplomacy in quiet. You don't go out there and tell people what you're going to do. Tell people what you've done. Tell them about your results. If you're going to tell people what you're going to do, it better be in a condition where you can't be derailed by some crazy monkey who's just going to throw wrenches into the wheel. Because historically, every single time there's been a potential of a peace agreement, every single time there was enough lead time for the Hamas or other terrorist organization to derail it, it got derailed. The only time that it wasn't derailed, or when there wasn't enough time or momentum, or both, for them to actually stop it. It's the only times it ever happened. Right? And it was announced pretty much after the fact. Yeah, in some cases, it was like people knew a day or two in advance. It wasn't enough time to plan and actually do an attack. So, I mean, yeah, I guess you could say any random crazy can do anything at any time. That's true. But if they want to do anything kind of, with any hope of success from their point of view, which is disgusting to say, but yeah, then they would need a bit of time, at least several days, if not a week. But when your lead time is like 1, 2, or maybe 3 days tops, that's usually not enough lead time for the bad guys to plan and actually do something terrible. I mean, with like of any scale. But in the case of October 7th, that's exactly what happened. There's plenty of lead time. They've been practicing the invasion for a long time, for years. They've been building up their tunnel network for decades. They knew exactly where to go to do terrible things. They had maps drawn by Gazans who worked in Israel. Like, not just like, a Google map printed from whatever, which they, of course, could have done as well. But like specific local maps of inside the Moshavim and Kibbutzim saying, who lived where, what was behind which house, what was in each house, all these different things that only somebody who worked there would know. So the people that were being paid by Israelis to work among them, to give them a better chance at a better economic future, those very same people backstabbed the Israelis. Which is why when you ask Israelis, do you believe in the two-state solution? More and more, if not most of them already, they don't believe in it anymore. Yes, we used to be the majority. But people who believe in that two-state solution, including me, either don't believe in it anymore or are in a very, very fringe minority at this point. To think that it's just going to be what Oslo promised. It's not going to be. It's just not going to be what Oslo promised. It can't really be that. That process is long dead. Technically, the bones of it still walk around like a zombie and are among us, but that is not the reality. The bulk majority of people in this area, Jews and Arabs, on the Israeli side, don't want a two-state solution. Jews and Arabs don't want a two-state solution because we don't want to keep getting attacked by our neighbors who have their own control and their own guns, even though they don't have technically an army. They still have a lot of weapons and can do a lot of damage, as was seen on October 7th. And the Palestinians, they never wanted a two-state solution. Yeah, they agreed to one under Arafat, and then they never made it happen. So they don't believe in it and never have. And that's why at the end of the day, we're going to see the map redrawn yet again and a new reality be established here yet again in a different kind of agreement between Arabs and Jews, Muslims and Jews in this area, who are the two most prevalent religions in the area. And if you're going to tell me it's not a religious war, you don't understand a damn thing. This is 100% a religious war, and yet it also involves land and it also involves politics. If you don't understand that, I don't know what to tell you. It is a war between peoples, ethnicities, whatever you want to call them. War between religions. It is a war between politics. It is a war over land. It is a war over more than land. It is a war over control of this area. And for Jews, all we want is just our homeland. We don't want to expand. We've given up the Sinai twice. Just so you know, the Sinai Peninsula by itself is twice the size of what is now Israel. More than twice if you exclude the land that's controlled by the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. It's more than twice the size of our country, and we've given it up twice for peace. And in doing so, unfortunately, we've signaled to the Arabs, hey, you know what? It's okay to attack us. It's also okay to pretend that you have peace with us and then come and backstab us later, or to pretend that you have a truce with us and then come back stab us later. Because that's exactly what October 7th was. They were pretending that they were kind of not in an open war. They were, there was skirmishes, there were rocket fire, regular occasion. It was a war, yeah, but it was a low burning, low fire war. It was a managed war. And then they took the first opportunity to stab us that they could. You want to debate me? Come on this show sometime. Let me know. Leave a comment. I'll be happy to debate you. Till then, peace.